Welcome to LRA Live, presented by Republic National Distributing Company with support from Jack Daniel's Whiskey. I'm Wendy Warren, Vice President of Communications for the Louisiana Restaurant Association. LRA Live is designed to aid you in charting your next steps as we continue to navigate 2020 and beyond. We hope this information presented in this two-day series benefits you at a time when you need it the most. Remember to drink responsibly and make your next whiskey order a Jack Daniel's. Check out the video.
I've always wanted to do that.
We'll have one of everything. I always wanted to do this. I've always wanted to do that.
I've always wanted to do that.
I always wanted to do that!
I always wanted to do that.
Next round on me.
Cute. So this is day 2 of our virtual LRA Live virtual event. If you were unable to join us yesterday for those sessions, don't worry, they will all be available on our website in the coming week. If you are a member of the LRA, there is no doubt you're familiar with our next speaker, perhaps even on a first name basis. Michelle Anderson, partner at Fisher Phillips, represents all employers in all aspects of employment law in both state and federal courts and before administrative agencies. Fisher Phillips has served as the LRA's general counsel for labor and employment for over 2 decades. And now I'll turn it over to Michelle, who's going to tell us to leave us alone. We're handling absences from work and what that means.
We just want 2020 to leave us alone. We've had enough. We've had enough. Well, great to be with everyone this morning. We obviously don't have a lot of time, but I want to go through and hit some high points on addressing workplace absences. I would say that addressing workplace absences and accommodations, and particularly in context of the pandemic, have been a lot of the LRA calls that we've been receiving over the past several months. So I thought it would be sort of helpful as a refresher for people who are starting to bring back more staff. And obviously the pandemic continues to rage on. We've been doing, a lot of things right in this state, but, we can't control everything. And so we still do have people who are getting sick. We still have people who are immune compromised or are in, categories where they're more susceptible if they get the disease to succumb to it. And a vaccine, although on the horizon, I will tell you is not probably going to be widely available for many, many, many months, as well as even once it becomes available, there will be a sort of a pecking order or a phased in order of who's going to get it. And so many of us may be toward the back end of those phases. So with all of that in mind, I'll go ahead and start the presentation. For, I believe, LRA members, this will be made available to you. There are actually some links in the presentation that I'll point out to you to get you to some additional resources. And then at the end, if you have questions, I put the email address for the LRA for you to reach out for questions. And certainly, if any of those need to come to me, then they'll pass those along. Okay, so yes, leave me alone. So some laws that are affecting attendance. We, of course, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or the FFCRA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Family Medical Leave Act, Pregnancy Discrimination, Workers' Compensation, and then, of course, state and local leave laws. I will tell you again, this is hitting a broad brush, high point presentation because Any number of these could take us an hour or more to really dive into and get way into the weeds. But this is really designed to help you spot the issues and know when you might need to ask questions and ask for help or legal advice. So the Coronavirus Response Act came up with two pieces of leave that we did not have before, and they are paid leave that we did not have before on the federal level. So there's emergency paid sick leave, and that is leave for up to 2 weeks or 80 hours, 10 days, however you want to slice it. If they're a full-time employee, if they're a part-time employee, it's going to be the average hours that they would work over that 2-week period using a look back method. There's no minimum length of employment for the person to have been with you. So they could have worked for you a week and then come up with a reason where they would be eligible for emergency paid sick leave, and you would be obligated to provide it to them. Expanded family and medical leave added an additional category to the Family and Medical Leave Act that was paid. For that, they have to be employed at least 30 days, and this is for leave up to 12 weeks, 2 of which could run concurrent with paid sick leave because we've got a child out of school or out of daycare, and I'll get more into the definitions here just quickly. This is applicable to businesses with fewer than 500 employees at the time leave is taken. So many of you may have been going into the pandemic, you might have had more than 500 employees, but because of the pandemic, you had to reduce down, and now you are under 500 employees. And so it's going to be looking at what is the head count at the time that the leave is to be taken. And this is not counting just full-time. This is anybody. This is full-time, part-time people that you have on your payroll. So less than 500. At this point, it still does expire at the end of this calendar year, December 31, 2020. But we do not see at this point any movement to expand it. But of course, we know that things are going to change in January. We're going to have a new president. We're going to have potentially a change in Congress. And so, it is possible that part of the ongoing efforts to keep people afloat and going back to work will include some kind of extension of this. But at this point, we've heard nothing of the sort. But do remember that this is in effect through the end of the calendar year. And here's one of the first links that I mentioned to you is the U.S. Department of Labor's frequently asked questions and continuing guidance. I think they're well over 100 at this point. I have to laugh because when this was passed, the whole idea was to make it simple for businesses to administer, particularly businesses who had never administered a leave program, let alone a paid leave program before. I will tell you that the regulations have made that a little bit inaccurate. It is not always easy to administer, but certainly we're here to help and answer those questions as we've now been doing this for many months. So emergency paid sick leave, there are 6 reasons that somebody may be eligible to take leave. And again, this is no minimum length of service to take this leave. They could start with you and have a qualifying reason. Really, the ones we're probably getting the most questions about right now are people who have been exposed and have been told to self-quarantine for 14 days because they fit the contact tracing of 6/15/48, which means you've been within 6 feet of someone for a period of 15 minutes or longer in the 48 hours prior to the point that they either started to have symptoms or they tested. This becomes kind of a little bit of a puzzle. So you have to know when someone started to get sick and when somebody went and got tested, because those might not be the exact same dates. And then we have to contact trace from there. So we have, a fair number of people who are in that number 2 category. And then of course, the number 3 category where the person is experiencing symptoms and they're seeking a medical diagnosis to confirm whether or not it is COVID, and they may or may not have been exposed to somebody and even know where it came from. And then I would say, subject to those first 2 reasons that we're seeing, then we're seeing some combination of 4 and 5, where we've got either they have to care for somebody who has to quarantine or is sick, or we have a child's school that may still be closed and maybe doing a virtual learning instead of in-person learning. So the emergency paid sick leave, this is a refundable tax credit to the employer. And so the idea was that employers would be fronting obviously the paid leave, but then you can claim it back on your quarterly or annual taxes. Reasons 1 through 3 on the prior screen, that is paid either at their regular rate, the federal minimum wage, or the applicable state or local minimum wage. Of course, here we do not have a higher minimum wage in the state of Louisiana. And if you have people who are, say, tipped employees, so you're paying them $2.13 an hour or something less than $7.25, and you're using tips to bring them up to $7.25, well, then that is their wage. Their regular rate of pay is the federal minimum wage of $7.25. And so they can receive a maximum of $511 per day, or $5,110 over the sick leave period, which again is just that 2 weeks. For reasons 4 through 6, that's at the 2/3. And so that's a maximum of $200 per day or $2,000 over the entire 2-week period. So then we have the expanded FMLA. And again, this is something that was added on to the regular FMLA, which we'll talk about in a minute, that normally applies to people that have 50 or more employees. But in this instance, this expanded FMLA applies when you have 500 or fewer. So if they have a son or daughter who is out of school because of the public health emergency, because the school is closed or the daycare is closed, then they can receive up to 12 weeks of leave. And that would assume that they've taken 2 weeks under the emergency paid sick leave law, but this again is at 2/3 of the pay. Now, if someone is just simply choosing to keep their child out of school, that's not going to fall within here. And again, if you go to that link on the FAQs that I provided, you're going to see updated guidance from the Department of Labor about when a school is considered closed versus a parent's decision to keep them home. Now, again, this leave is assuming that an employee cannot telework from home. And obviously in this industry, most people cannot telework. Certainly if you're a server, a cook, a bartender, general manager, you probably could not work from home. But you may have administrative people in your businesses that could work from home. Instead of giving them leave, they might be able to work remotely for the 2-week period or again, up to the 12-week period while the child is out of school or daycare. So do keep that in mind that there might be other options. So let's move into the regular Americans with Disabilities Act issues and Family Medical Leave Act. So the Americans with Disabilities, that protects people with a disability. And it could require that we provide a reasonable period of unpaid leave as an accommodation for a disability. Whereas FMLA, the person has to have worked for you for at least 12 months in the last 7 years. And it doesn't have to be consecutive. So it could be, say they worked for you 6 months a couple years ago, and then they came back and now they're working for you again and they've been with you, another 6 months. We would look back over 7 years to see how long they'd worked for you. So that would be, have they worked at least 12 months? Then when we look back in the last 12 months prior to taking leave, have they worked at least 1,250 hours? Well, most people who are working more than part-time will meet that pretty handily. Then we get into, do you have 50 or more employees within the 75-mile radius? And so this is where many of you may not qualify to be considered a covered employer under the FMLA. However, if you have interest in multiple businesses, particularly if you have multiple locations and you might be sharing employees or you have common ownership, there is a chance that you would still be a covered employer when we aggregate your entities together. So don't just look at in a silo and assume that you may not be covered under the FMLA, because that can be a fact-intensive analysis. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, that is applicable to businesses with 15 or more employees. It's looking at what can the employee do, what are their essential functions of the job, and do they require a reasonable accommodation to perform essential functions of the job. And when I say essential functions are, these are the things that if the employee cannot do them, the job completely falls apart. So for many of us in this particular industry, attendance is an essential function of the job. And if they cannot attend work, then we might not be able to accommodate them, or we may have an obligation to figure out, is there a way that we can accommodate them that would allow them to attend work? So again, an employee has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And this might be obviously physical, you might be able to observe it. Mental impairment, you may not be able to observe it, and that can be really difficult at times. Someone may also have a history of impairment, but maybe it's controlled with medication or other ameliorative efforts, but that doesn't make the disability any less just because it's controlled. So FMLA looks at a different sort of area. It obviously for birth or adoption of a child, or time off for prenatal care, but this is not just limited to the mother. Men who are caregivers could also have time off related to the birth or adoption of a child. Care for a employee's spouse or child or parent with a serious health condition or their own serious health condition. And then there are military related reasons for time away from work. And I'll tell you, I have yet in all of my years of practice ever dealt with a military related FMLA claim or inquiry, but it does exist. And so just you need to be aware of that. The DOL has a lot of notices and forms available through their website that you can access here through this link on this page. So when we're comparing these two leaves, the FMLA is for an employee and family members as defined by the law. It could be limited to 12 weeks if it has to do with a serious health condition of the employee or their family member, or the birth or adoption of a child, 26 weeks for certain kinds of military related leave. There are, as we discussed before, there are length of service requirements, and there is no defense that the person being out on leave presents an undue hardship for your business, versus the ADA, where it is reserved to employees only, open-ended as to what might be reasonable accommodation. That requires you as a business to go through an interactive process and to identify what accommodations are available that could reasonably accommodate the individual's disability to allow them to continue to work. There is no length of service requirement, so someone could start with you and a week later have a need related to their disability and be asking for some kind of accommodation. And then there is a defense as to undue hardship, but undue hardship really starts getting into a fact-intensive economic analysis as to whether or not it would be harmful to the business. So again, a lot of times employers are really quick to say, no, we can't do that. But I will tell you, having a prior career and working with people with disabilities, that oftentimes the accommodation can be made with little or no cost to the individual. But when we start talking about leave, expressly about leave related to a disability, of course, undefined periods of absences or open-ended types of we have no predictability when the absence is going to occur. Well, then of course, then we're getting into an undue hardship analysis. Been getting a lot of questions about pregnancy lately. I'm guessing because people were cooped up during the pandemic, and now we're going to have a little bit of a baby boom. So anyway, there is the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and basically we need to make sure that we're treating employees the same as we would treat non-pregnant employees. We might have a duty to offer accommodations if they're requested. I get a fair amount of calls, people assuming that pregnant women cannot do certain types of work. Pregnant women have been working for many, many, many years, and they're able to do a lot of things even though they are creating a human. So do not just assume that somebody who is pregnant is a delicate flower and cannot do certain things. Now, there might be restrictions from their doctor, and certainly we can address that. But I'm getting a lot of calls of people making assumptions about the abilities of pregnant women to do certain types of work. So please use caution there because you might be discriminated against them. So when it comes to providing leave, again, we talked about FMLA, but you may not be subject to it because you might not have 50 or more employees within 75 miles. but there are still some businesses that do provide time off for pregnant women. And so if it's for bonding leave versus just time to recuperate, you need to make sure that you're offering the same thing to your male employees. But again, there is a distinction because the woman who's giving birth may need obviously some recuperation time, depending on if it's a natural birth or cesarean section, C-section, then they might need a different amount of time. But if you're simply giving off leave for people to bond with the child, then according to the EEOC, we would have a duty to provide an equivalent leave to new fathers as well. So Louisiana does have a pregnancy-related disability law. It applies to businesses with at least 25 employees. This is leave for pregnancy, including related medical conditions. So this is not bonding leave. This is related to the health of the mother. And certainly if it's a normal birth and everything goes according to plan, you could expect that they'd be back probably in about 8 weeks. But the law does allow them up to 4 months, which would be 16 weeks. If the healthcare provider says that they need that amount of time. Now it's unpaid, but if you do have a paid leave program that you have for your employees and you allow them to accrue that leave, then they need to be allowed to use that if they have it, but otherwise it's unpaid. At the conclusion of the leave, they're supposed to be restored to their prior position, pay and benefits. Now, this does run concurrently with FMLA. So if you are an employer that is subject to the FMLA, you can run 12 of the 16 weeks concurrent with the FMLA. So what about workers' compensation? People do, of course, still get injured on the job from time to time. Of course, this is usually a transitory condition. It's not going to be a disability, but it certainly is going to focus on what they can't do because of the injury. And there will generally be some sort of maybe wage replacement or modified job duties or time away from work due to the workers' compensation injury. What's important to remember, though, is that workers' compensation leave, it should run concurrently with the FMLA, again, if you're subject to it because you have 50 or more employees. I've had a lot of calls over the years where I have businesses that are subject to the FMLA and they had someone get injured at work and then they go out on leave and it's like an abyss. It's a black hole. And a year later, they're saying, well, this person went out on workers' comp leave and we don't know what's going on and they haven't come back, but their claim is still open. And my first question will be, did you run it concurrently with FMLA? And usually I get crickets in response. See, when we run it concurrently with the FMLA, we can control and say, okay, well, if you can't come back at the end of 12 weeks, then we're going to get into an analysis about how much longer can we allow you to be out on leave before it's an undue hardship to the business and we need to just go ahead and fill the position. There is no obligation under workers' compensation law to hold someone's job open for any period of time, let alone indefinitely, while they are recovering from a workers' compensation injury. Now, that said, the law does have a retaliation component, so we cannot just fire somebody because they were injured on the job and filed a claim. But a lot of times people forget that we can run these two things together, which gives us a little bit better roadmap when we get to the end of that 12 weeks and the person still hasn't come back and it looks like they may not be back for quite a much more period of time. So, if they have been out for 12 weeks and we run out of the job protected FMLA, then we're going to look at an ADA analysis. Is there a reasonable amount of additional unpaid leave that we could afford somebody that would allow them to return? So for example, say someone can't return at 12 weeks, but they just need another 2 weeks because they can't get the appointment with their doctor to be cleared to return to work. Would we say, great, we'll give you another 2 weeks. That's fine. We can accommodate that because we probably couldn't fill your job in the 2 weeks anyway. And then, they go and in 2 weeks, the doctor says, yep, you're cleared. Go ahead, go back to work and we're good. But if we get this, well, I'm out for another 2 months and then I got to visit my doctor and I'm out for and then maybe another 2 months. Well, then we're probably going to be falling back into, at some point, we can no longer accommodate it. Any of you who've ever seen me speak on this topic before, I liken it to a chess game. And this is where, they're making a move. We're looking at the information being provided and then we're making making a move. And until we kind of get to a checkmate situation where, you know, we're going to go ahead and end the employment, but you want to be careful not to do that prematurely. When we're talking about workers' comp and FMLA, while they're on it, we cannot force somebody to take modified duty under FMLA. If they are entitled to FMLA and they qualify for FMLA, then they're entitled to take it. We can certainly offer them the modified duty that workers' comp might be recommending, but we can't force it under the FMLA. And then, like I said, once it expires, then we're looking at, you know, can we bring them back permanently with no restrictions, or is there some kind of modified duty we need in order to bring them back safely? Don't forget that under FMLA that might be intermittent. Same with ADA, the leave might be intermittent because it might be just for, say, appointments or treatment, therapy, thing like that. And certainly if the intermittent or reduced schedule would be a complication for the needs of the business, we might have to look at a temporary assignment to an alternative position until that leave runs, and then we would have to restore them at the end. Okay, so what do we do about the person that can't come back? So, you know, usually the question I get is, well, we just say if you can't come back after so many weeks, we fire you. The EEOC does not like those policies. Neither do plaintiffs' lawyers. Well, plaintiffs' lawyers like them because then, you know, they have a right to, you know, they want to come after you for it. But you got to be careful about having these hard line in the sand policies that say, you know, we're just going to fire you if you can't come back after so many weeks. We have to make an individual determination why employees cannot return to work. We have to look at, you know, the big picture. Is there, you know, an ADA issue afoot, or is it simply a serious health condition that's transitory? They're not disabled. Looking again at whether we might have an obligation to provide an additional period of leave under the ADA as an accommodation, and knowing that, you know, there are no real absolutes under the ADA accommodation. So with that, I will come out and I guess we can answer any questions, should there be any.
I don't see any at the moment. And we are approaching our end time. So if you do have questions for Michelle and you're an LRA member, we can connect you with her at communications@lra.org. You can always email us. For specific legal or other advice, we encourage you to contact your attorney or us at the LRA office if you're a member and you wish to be connected to Michelle as our general counsel. The information and opinions provided by today's speakers are not representative of the policies of the LRA. Please remember these sessions are being recorded, and the links that she included in her presentation we will provide on our website at lra.org should you want to revisit any of this information. Those who have attended Michelle's session this morning will be entered into a drawing for a hand-thrown and painted oyster platter by Fire and Earth Pottery valued at $250, and we'll contact the winner via email at the end of the week. Our next session, 6 questions every business owner should answer post-COVID with Helene Wall of Postal Wait in Netterville, will begin in just a few minutes. And be sure to tune in at 10 o'clock when Sean Kennedy of the National Restaurant Association talks to us about what the election outcome means for restaurants. That concludes this morning's session, and I thank you, Michelle, for joining us and sponsoring this session on behalf of Fisher & Phillips.
Great.
Thank you.
Great to be with everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.